Under Article 5, Section 14 of the Oregon Constitution, I am exercising my authority as governor to issue a temporary reprieve in the case of Gary Haugen during the remainder of my term in office. I want to use this opportunity to share with Oregonians how and why I arrived at this decision. Earlier this morning, I spoke to members of the victims' families. My heart goes out to them. Oregon has a long and turbulent history with capital punishment. Our Constitution originally had no provision for the death penalty. Enacted by statute in 1864, the death penalty was repealed in 1914, restored in 1920, repealed again in 1964, reenacted in 1978, declared unconstitutional by the Oregon Supreme Court in 1981, and again reinstated by the voters in 1984. It has been carried out only twice in the last 49 years, both during my first administration as governor, once in 1996 and once in 1997. I allowed those sentences to be carried out, notwithstanding my personal opposition to the death penalty. At the time, I was torn between the deep questions I have about the morality of capital punishment and my oath to uphold the Oregon Constitution. Those were the most agonizing and difficult decisions I have ever made as governor, and I have revisited and questioned them over and over again for the past 14 years. I do not believe those executions made us safer. Certainly, I don't believe they made us more noble as a society, and I simply cannot participate once again in something that I believe to be morally wrong. Let me be very clear. I had no sympathy and no compassion for those criminals, nor do I for Mr. Haugen or for anyone who commits the most heinous of crimes, taking the life of another person. The families and friends of these victims deserve certainty that justice will be carried out on behalf of the loved ones who have been taken away from them. But the nature of their crimes were not different from those of other murderers, some of whom were sentenced to death and not executed, others who were sentenced to life in prison. What distinguished those two members of death row was that they volunteered to die. Oregonians have a fundamental belief in fairness and justice, and in justice that is swift and certain. But the death penalty as it is practiced in Oregon today is neither fair nor just. It is neither swift nor certain, and it is not applied equally to all. In my mind, it is a perversion of justice when the single best indicator of who will or will not be executed in this state has nothing to do with the circumstances of the crime or the findings of a jury. The only factor that determines in Oregon whether somebody sentenced to death will actually be executed is that they volunteer to die. The hard truth is that in the 27 years since Oregonians reinstated the death penalty, it has only been carried out on two individuals, both of whom volunteered to die by giving up their right of appeals. In the years since those executions, many judges and district attorneys, many legislators, many proponents and opponents of the death penalty, victims and families have agreed that Oregon's system is broken. But we've done nothing. We've avoided the question. Many states during that time have reconsidered the application of capital punishment due to public concerns, due to evidence of wrongful convictions, due to the unequal application of the law, the expense of the process, and other reasons. Earlier this year, Illinois banned capital punishment, ending a legacy of faulty convictions, forced confessions, unreliable witnesses, and incompetent legal representation. New Jersey abolished capital punishment after determining they'd spent $250 million on a system that executed nobody. New Mexico recognized that the death penalty is neither a deterrent, an effective deterrent, nor fair to victims' families who were burdened with lengthy trials and appeals, and they replaced it with life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, we can no longer avoid the question. On Friday, another death warrant was issued for another member of death row, Gary Haugen, and once again, he too has volunteered to die. He is just one of 37 inmates on death row in Oregon. Some have been there over 20 years. All have many years and many appeals left before there is even a remote possibility that their sentences will be carried out. 2 died of natural causes after 10 years on death row. The reality is that in Oregon, our death sentence is essentially an extremely expensive life prison term. Far more expensive than the terms of others who were sentenced to life in prison without parole rather than to death row. And while I think it is convenient, as some will, to blame the lengthy and expensive trial and appeals process on inmates working the system, the truth is that the courts and society is continually revisiting and reinterpreting how and under what circumstances it is acceptable for a state to kill somebody. The courts are applying stricter standards and continually raising the bar on death penalty prosecutions. Consider that only 6 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed its decision and ruled that it is unconstitutional to apply the death penalty to people under the age of 18. For a state intent on maintaining the death penalty, the result inevitably will be bigger questions, fewer options, and higher costs. It is time for this state to consider a different approach. I refuse to be part of a compromised and inequitable system any longer, and I will not allow further executions to take place while I'm governor. I do not make this decision lightly. It was the will of the voters in 1984 to reinstate the death penalty in Oregon, and I respect that. In fact, on 2 occasions, I carried out the will of the voters. Decisions that I have regretted ever since, both because of my deep personal convictions about capital punishment, but also because in practice Oregon has an expensive, unworkable system that fails to meet the basic standards of justice. 27 years after the voters reinstated the death penalty, it is clear that the system is broken. To those who will inevitably say that my decision today compromises the will of the voters, I would simply point out that in practice it is the current system itself that compromises the will of the voters. I cannot imagine, nor do I believe, that voters intended to create a system in which those convicted and condemned to death could determine whether or not their sentence would be carried out. I could have commuted Mr. Haugen's sentence, and indeed the sentences of all those on death row to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I did not do that because the policy that our state adopts concerning capital punishment is not mine alone to make. It is a decision for the voters to make. My hope, and indeed my intention in taking this action today, is to bring about a long-due reevaluation of our current policy and our current system of capital punishment. Others will point to the opportunity in this reevaluation to speed appeals, to change the criteria of death penalty cases. I personally favor life in prison without the possibility of parole, and will advocate for that policy should we have a future debate on this issue. I call on the legislative branch to bring forth potential reforms to the 2013 legislature, and I encourage all citizens in this state to engage in a long overdue debate on this important issue. 14 years ago, I struggled over a decision to allow an execution to go forward. Over the years, I've thought that, given the same circumstances, I would make a different decision. That day has come. Thank you.
Governor, 50 years ago, when your predecessor, Mark Hatfield, faced the same question, and even though he did allow the execution to go forth, he also threw his weight behind a ballot measure that abolished the death penalty in 1964, 2 years after the execution. Would you be willing to do the same?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, again, a debate that has to be decided by the voters, but again, as I say, I think a much more rational, just system would be life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, without the endless appeals, without the cost, without the unequal application of the law.
Governor, could you take us through the process of how you came to this decision and when you reached it?
Well, I've been struggling with this decision for some time. This issue was only raised once during the campaign, interestingly enough, and it was at the forum over at the Mission Mill that was sponsored, I think, by the League of Women Voters. So it may have been taped. I don't know. That's the only time the question came up. It was me and all of the Republican candidates. Well, all but one. And I was asked that question, and I was very candid about the reflection that I've gone through over the last 14 years, and said I wasn't at all sure that I would make the same decision. I've been waiting, obviously, for the appeals process to finish and for the death warrant to be issued, but I've actually finally made this decision sometime last week, I guess, was when I finally.
Why not act months ago to save the cost, the uncertainty?
Well, there's a process in place, and it seemed to me that, again, we didn't know at the time whether a death warrant would actually be issued for Mr. Haugen, and I guess I was interested and felt it was important to be able to point out that once again, the only people, convicted murderers for whom the death penalty is actually implemented, are people who volunteer. And we have 3 instances now in almost 50 years.
Governor, how did the victims' family members respond?
There were private conversations. My heart goes out to them. Unquestionably, this decision will delay the closure that they deserve.
On a different subject, there's an article today in the paper about Pilates, PERS payments.
We're here today. Today.
Do you have any comments about that?
I don't, not today. I think that issue is somewhat less relevant. Yes?
Do you believe that there's public support out there to abolish the death penalty?
I don't know, but I think it's a debate that we haven't had for 27 years. And again, I don't think anybody, even strong supporters of capital punishment, could possibly argue that this system is accomplishing what they intended, or that it is just, or that the application of it is equitable. So I think that's an important debate for Oregonians to have. And if, in fact, they reinstate the death penalty, at least they will do so with their eyes open, and hopefully we'll make changes to make it a more rational process.
Governor, you said that you won't allow another execution as governor of the state. Is it, by the timing, is it possible that with the legislature and voters get involved, that it could come back around and appeals could move quickly enough that Gary Haugen could be executed under your governorship?
Well, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, but I think that this process is going to take us a little while. If the legislature acts in 2013, they're looking at a ballot measure, unquestionably, because this is a constitutional provision, and I expect that couldn't possibly be on until 13 or 14.
Governor, your personal opposition has not changed since the Supreme Court back in 1981 invalidated the then existing death penalty, because I believe you called it a barbaric solution to criminality at that point. In that while you were willing to let the question be decided by voters, you were personally opposed.
Is that a question?
The question is, you've never changed your mind personally.
No, I haven't. And it was, I must say that it was, as I said earlier, it was a very difficult decision. I don't think the right one that I made 14 years ago. On one hand, I am a medical doctor who took an oath to do no harm, and it was a conflicting set of personal convictions and also the issue of the Constitution. And but it's become very clear to me over time that this is not. I just don't think it serves justice.
Have you had any conversations with Mr. Haugen's attorneys or communicated to him somehow?
No.
Are there any particulars about Mr. Haugen's case that make you feel that this verdict, that the death penalty sentence was unjust?
No, this really has nothing to do with Gary Haugen. It has to do with a system. It has to do with two things. One, my personal convictions about capital punishment, and secondly, a system that essentially only carries out capital punishment on people who volunteer. And I just find that a difficult system to defend morally, in my case, or practically.
Governor, your personal feeling about this would outweigh any system of capital punishment in the state. Is that accurate? I mean, there's no system of execution that...
I do not support capital punishment.
Governor, I understand your moral view on this, and I respect that. I'm having problem understanding your analysis that it only those people who volunteer to be executed are executed, because people arguably could say that's because of the convoluted appeals process, and that's where the flaw lies.
Well, I think there are people who could argue that, and I think they would be right. I mean, it is the appeals process, but it is also, and that's one thing that needs to be looked at, certainly. But I think if you step back, the application of capital punishment and death sentences is very uneven. What is the rationale for a system that sentences one murderer, one individual who commits aggravated murder, to life in prison, and another individual who commits aggravated murder to death, but only if he volunteers? What's the rationale for that system? I can't see it.
You support the Death with Dignity Act?
I did.
Can you square these two views, opposed to capital punishment and supportive of death with dignity?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think the fundamental difference is the Oregon's Death with Dignity statute applies to individuals who are very near the end of their life, who have a terminal illness and are interested in maintaining their own dignity and dealing with an inevitable outcome in their own way. This is a punishment that society is inflicting upon an individual. And I guess my basic belief is that society should not be able to take away something it can't grant. We can grant people freedom if they live within the context of laws that apply to all of us, and we can take that freedom away and lock them up forever if they violate that. But I think capital punishment, as practiced by a civilized society, is very problematic.
Governor, a related question, which I'm almost hesitant to bring up, and that is the issue of abortion, and how in your own mind can you, and I don't want to turn this into an abortion debate, but how in your own mind can you square sort of continuing life in this regard, but your support for the right to abortion?
Again, I think that is a different case, and I'm not going to get into, a philosophic debate about when life begins. But I do think a woman has every right for reproductive freedom, and that's not something that I think that is any business of the state of Oregon or the government of the United States to interfere in.
Can you say who you consulted with in coming to this decision? Did you talk with the Attorney General?
Well, mostly myself.
Did you speak with the Attorney General at all or anything like that?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.